Hello and welcome to this Monday's weekly market briefing. We've got lots to talk about, but firstly, US delegation heads to Taiwan after voters defy China, as well as that Republican rivals in last-ditch bid to cut Trump's big lead in frozen Iowa primaries. We've got lots to talk about in the charts, also lots happening on the economic calendar, with another article to talk about as well, with banks saying US consumers in good shape, but poll shows Biden gets no credit. But as I said, we've got lots to talk about in the charts, lots to talk about in the economic calendar. Before we get straight into it, make sure to subscribe. But the first article, obviously, to talk about is the US delegation which is heading to Taiwan. Now, a high-level US delegation full of former top officials will arrive in Taiwan today. Yesterday. Did arrive yesterday. This follows Taiwan on Saturday electing Lei Ching-te from the more anti-CCP Democratic Progressive Party. Now, we've been talking about US and Chinese relations for quite some time now. Obviously, it's a very important topic to stay on top of in relation to the markets. Understanding how the US and China interacting is not only important for understanding how US equities may fare, because obviously global trade for the US and other nations around the world obviously relies greatly on China. But as well as that, of course, US and Chinese relations matter greatly when we're looking at certain safe haven assets like gold, or looking at other commodities such as oil, which like gold also depends greatly on world tensions. And often when we do talk about China nowadays, we are talking about it from a world tensions perspective. We are constantly kind of talking about the issue of Taiwan and a possible invasion into Taiwan, of course. And from this, the market does make their perceptions known through the swap markets, and also, the amount of gold's price, and as a result, staying on top of these important topics are so important, as we did see when Russia invaded Ukraine, and we did watch the price of gold go sky high. And whilst it may not be a world relations or world tensions issue, the topic of COVID and COVID lockdowns also did send gold to new highs never seen before. So these are two scenarios where a level of instability in the world can cause certain assets such as gold to go to their greatest highs of their lifetime, basically. And ultimately, this is why it's so important to stay on top of. But generally, when we've been talking about China, it is on that front. We know that China and the US are struggling with their kind of relations at the moment. There's been some efforts to obviously kind of mend that, but as a result of certain incidents recently, such as the Chinese spy balloon over the US and other incidents, of course, and the US's increasing support for Taiwan, which China considers as a separatist movement. These kind of incidents are creating greater kind of tensions between the two nations of the world at the moment. And so this is why it's so important to stay on top of this topic. Now, China has denounced Lei as a dangerous separatist due to his interest in making clear Taiwan's independence from the Chinese mainland. Lei, however, only received 40% of the vote, with the DPP losing control of the legislative branch, which has been seen by the CCP as proof that the DPP does not represent Taiwan's voters as a whole. This was important, of course, because ultimately the legislative branch is such an important branch within the entirety of the government. Without the legislative branch, you won't be able to pass that important legislature, which wounds up into the movement by the government to do this or do that. And obviously the legislative branch will have the greatest control over things like military spending, which obviously concern China the most. But ultimately, we're in an interesting situation following this election, ultimately, because we do have that executive branch, once again being run by the DPP, that more anti-CCP group. But then at the same time, we do have that split legislature with the more pro talks with Chinese mainland parties having control over that. So it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic works out and whether that will actually tame the kind of worries that China does have at the moment in relation to the Taiwan independence movement. Now, China has also lashed out at the UK, US, and Japan for congratulating Lei on his victory. The US delegation, though, will be meeting Taiwanese politicians and congratulate them on their successful elections, whilst also supporting Taiwan's continued prosperity and growth. Of course, the US has, grown in its kind of interests in Taiwan's economic performance and their economic situation. Obviously, Taiwan owns and has quite a large monopoly really on the chip making industry with, I believe, the company TSMC. And as a result of that, the US has looked to strengthen their relations with Taiwan, and this is going to be a recurring kind of topic of conversation even going into the US elections later this year, is how the kind of economic situation in Taiwan will be handled, and the world tensions with China will also be handled as well. Now, the US has previously sent a delegation in 2008, but never with former senior officials. Observers see this as a risky move since the CCP objects to Taiwan's interactions with outside governments and especially Western powers like the US. This comes also at a tense time for US and Chinese relation following certain incidents. Biden, however, has said that following the elections, he does not support Taiwan's independence in a move to reassure Beijing. So that's an interesting thing to note as well. Obviously, we do have a more pro-independence candidate that's winning this election, but ultimately the US has remained clear in that it doesn't want to escalate this into a conflict by making clear that they do not support the independence of Taiwan. And this is despite really the US kind of behind closed doors really recognizing Taiwan as an independent nation. So I think that's something that's really interesting to note, most definitely. That's all to talk about on this article, though. Keep your eyes on it, as it will be affecting world tensions and assets such as gold, which we'll come to in near the end, and where we'll actually be able to analyse how this election has affected gold's price. So keep your eyes on that. Next article to talk about, though, is Republican rivals in this year's Republican primaries. Now, over the weekend, Trump and his Republican rivals battled over support from Iowa's voters, and this comes in a final act of campaigning before the state caucuses launched today. Now, obviously, the Republican primaries are a very important process within the US election sphere. Ultimately, they begin in January and begin today for the Republicans in Iowa, and usually begin in Iowa and New Hampshire, where we're really able to see how the states of Iowa and New Hampshire feel about the key candidates which are running for Republican nomination in this case. But last election it was Democrats running for their nomination. But ultimately, it's important to understand how voters are feeling, and we often see following these initial kind of primaries, certain candidates dropping out, and so that will be the key thing to look out for. And obviously, understanding the key, nominees will always be important for understanding how the economic policy what sort of economic policy will be implemented, what sort of world international politics kind of message will be put out by these candidates if they do come into power, which is why it's so important to understand which candidates are strong and which candidates are likely to drop out and that sort of thing. But ultimately, Trump is hoping to have an overwhelming majority in the Iowa polls to shut down obviously competition from Republican rivals, and therefore set him in a good step to battle Biden, of course, coming to the end of this year. And I think, to no surprise, is Trump really the the kind of leading candidate for the Republicans. It does still seem that he does have that very strong supporting base, which is quite unlike most candidates I think we've seen before. And this is creating a tough time, obviously, for Republican rivals. Obviously, near the start of last year, really, during the invisible primaries, we were really talking about Ron DeSantis and the strengths of a candidate like him, which obviously had his successes during the COVID lockdown period, where he kind of, took the more liberal, libertarian approach to lockdowns and instead allowed many citizens to kind of go about their lives without those usual restrictions. And as a result, he gained a strong follower base from those more Trump following Republicans. But as we are nearing closer to more of these primaries, it does seem that a candidate like Ron DeSantis is once again losing his fan base to, where he basically found his fan base with Trump. So that's something to note, of course. Nikki Haley is now Trump's top rival, Republican rival, after moving into second place in Iowa polls. And this is important to note, as we have been kind of tracking Nikki Haley coming to her well-known position at the moment within the Republican primaries. Now, Haley is trying to narrow the gap with the former president to put her in good stead, with Ron DeSantis now losing momentum. And now, if he does fail to prove himself in Iowa, he may drop out due to pressure, of course, and this is largely as a result of most of his voter base largely being traditional Trump supporters. A recent blizzard in Iowa, however, prompted many candidates to cancel campaign stops. Current polls show 48% of Iowa backing Trump, 20% Haley, and DeSantis 16%, with, I believe, Vivek Ramaswamy also having 8% support, with Trump winning the support of evangelical Christians and Haley winning more amongst the more university-educated, moderate and independent voters. Trump has also started bashing his rivals, attacking Ramaswamy for the first time, accusing the 38-year-old of using deceitful campaign tricks. So that's interesting to note, of course, because Ramaswamy really has been the most vocal supporter within the Republican rivals of Trump to actually support Trump, in his current status where he is running for Republican nomination. And it does seem that Ramaswamy has been trying to appeal to those very pro-Trump supporters, and it does seem now that that's getting on Trump's nerves. So we'll keep on top of this topic, of course, as we do go into Iowa's primaries today. So listen out for what's going on with that. Next article to talk about, though, is banks and Biden. Now, we'll have to get through this article quick, but ultimately, US banks believe US consumers have weathered the Fed's cycle of rate rises in good shape, and this comes as new polls present Biden with no credit with kind of voters ahead of November's elections. Consumer confidence is expected to play a large role in the elections, with polls on Sunday showing only 13% of Americans feeling they are better off under the current US president. The economy now sees inflation down to 3.4% from 9.1% a year ago, with unemployment also low at 3.7%. However, less than a third of those polled see Biden as doing a good job when it comes to managing the economy. 4 large banks and their executives from JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citi and Wells Fargo has also said their consumers have been resilient, with the finances of the bank's customers remaining in good shape despite their accounts maybe not being as full as they were during the middle of COVID lockdowns. The bank did note, however, savers had less money than 12 months ago, and defaults are climbing. Banks such as JP Morgan also reported strong profits as a result of higher interest rates, but Citi also said it could lay off up to 20,000 workers over the next 3 years as a result of consumers being unable to pay back their loans. Therefore, banks are setting aside billions to cover potential loan losses and keeping unemployment levels low at 3.7% will be essential to keep those loan losses manageable, according to bank executives. Keep your eyes on this topic, of course, but we've spent a lot of time on the articles. So now to move on to the charts, where firstly to begin, of course, is US indices and the US 30. Now, as we can see here, the US 30 has sold off from that key liquidity zone and resistance level at the top of the market, as we did end off last week. Now, lots of economic data, lots of world tensions, and lots of politics has been playing into the fact of where the US 30 is sitting currently. Ultimately, we are still sitting at all-time highs, and so it is still a positive message for US indices as a whole. But ultimately, we were ending off last week kind of expecting maybe even a breakthrough to higher levels, as we did gain that resurgence in bullish momentum for the US 30. So it will be interesting to see whether we can continue that bullish momentum going into this week, or in fact now we've come into contact with that key liquidity zone, we're going to be selling off for some time. So definitely keep your eyes on this situation. As for the dollar low, the dollar does remain in the current range that it's kind of been sitting in for quite some time now, and ultimately this is kind of hinting to us not much momentum at all. It'll be interesting to hear though this week's US retail sales and consumer sentiment figure and see if that kind of plays into where the dollar is. But ultimately, despite a lot of US inflation data recently, US unemployment data, we haven't actually seen that much momentum come out of the dollar from that. And so it's really hard to kind of judge where the dollar could go from here as a result of, seeing that lack of momentum. Ultimately, it will be interesting to see is how, price continues to react to these key liquidity zones, though, going throughout this week. And I think that will be the key thing to note, of course. Next to talk about, though, is Euro USD. So still on the topic of the dollar. And as a result of following the dollar closely, also is not seeing much momentum. It is, however, sitting on that key liquidity zone. And so it'll be interesting to see whether that will provide maybe some momentum, some liquidity, but ultimately price has interacted with this level before, and it's more so acted as an area of stagnation rather than key liquidity. So, keep your eyes on Euro USD, as we are getting some very important Eurozone and ECB data this week, which we will be coming to after the chart, so wait till then. Next to talk about, though, is pound yen, which has now retraced from its highs after breaking out of this range that it was sitting in for some while, and has retraced to that 50% Fibonacci level. Interestingly enough, that's just sitting above that key liquidity zone. So it'd be interesting to see whether we'll move away now from that 50%, or in fact we'll keep moving to the downside before tapping that 61.80, which is sitting within that key liquidity zone, and then maybe we'll see that move to the upside. So keep your eyes on the pound yen. Next to talk about is Bitcoin, which despite the SEC approving of that Bitcoin ETF applications from numerous asset managers last week, we have actually seen a sell-off. And I think this is very interesting to note, considering that last week when we were in the lead up to this announcement by the SEC, I did note how during that fake Twitter post where we did see the SEC apparently approve of a Bitcoin ETF application, ultimately we didn't see as much bullish momentum after hearing that, as we did see bearish momentum after hearing that the post was fake. And so I did hint to the fact that maybe investors have already priced in the SEC kind of accepting the applications and approving of it, and ultimately we're more likely to see bearish momentum from this decision because of investors already pricing in and people the SEC accepting the applications, and therefore we more so had sell-off potential than we did upside potential. And that is actually what we've seen. Despite that approval, we have seen price sell-off and now has reached the $42,000 a Bitcoin mark, which is a key liquidity zone as marked here, where prices previously moved in a bullish manner away from. So maybe we'll see a kind of return to the upside, but keep your eyes on that. It's very interesting to keep your eyes on. Gold, though, is in a very interesting position, ultimately because of world tensions recently and the data that we did receive last week. But I think most importantly, the world tensions news that we have had recently has driven gold to the upside, as I spoke about at the start of this weekly market briefing. I did talk about how world tensions greatly affects safe haven assets like gold, and considering we had US and UK as well as other allies striking Houthi targets within Yemen last week, and we also now have the DPP winning the election within Taiwan. Ultimately, this is wound up to be a very kind of escalatory situation for world tensions, and as a result has driven gold to the upside as investors begin to price in those higher world tensions, which is interesting to see because we really haven't seen too much momentum recently with gold. So maybe we'll start to see something interesting shaping up on there. Keep your eyes on gold. Lastly to talk about though is oil, where there's not too much to say apart from the fact that we did see price as a result of the strikes in Yemen. We did see oil spike to the upside, shooting above that key resistance and liquidity zone, and has now returned underneath it. So it'll be interesting to see whether that was just a short-term reaction to those strikes in Yemen, and in fact we will continue this sell side momentum that we've had for quite some time now. So definitely keep your eyes on oil, as we do have the potential always to move all the way down to that bottom level of the charts. So keep your eyes on the charts. Lastly to talk about, of course, though, is the economic calendar, which if we can load up here, we do have quite a bit of data coming out this week. Now, firstly, we will be getting German GDP growth and inflation rate figure, as well as that we're getting British unemployment rate figure and inflation rate figure. Along with that, we're getting the Eurozone and German economic sentiment figure, as well as the Canadian inflation rate figure. Important to note, of course, lots of inflation rate figures this week, most definitely. As well as that, we're getting the Chinese GDP growth rate figure, along with the Eurozone inflation rate figure. So, British, Eurozone, and, Canadian inflation rate. And we're also getting US retail sales and consumer sentiment figure, along with Aussie unemployment rate figures and Japanese inflation rate figure. So lots of data to listen out for this week. Keep your eyes on the charts. I think this will be a week full of momentum and liquidity. Hope you have a great trading week. But that's all from us at Wildwood Capital. We've covered lots in the articles, lots in the charts, and lots on the economic calendar. Have a great one. See you later. Bye.